In March of 1941, deep within the steel ribcage of a submarine at the Mare Island Naval Shipyard, a symphony of inefficiency was playing its deafening tune. It was a chaotic orchestra of clanging hammers, the high-pitched scream of metal drills, and the shouted curses of men contorting their bodies in a claustrophobic maze of scaffolding. This wasn't the sound of a nation preparing for war. It was the sound of a nation being held hostage by nuts and bolts. For the men working there, it was a daily battle. For the United States Navy, it was a logistical nightmare, bleeding away its most precious resource: time. At the heart of this storm stood Ted Nelson. He wasn't an engineer with a fancy degree, nor an officer with strategic command. He was a welder, a master of his craft, earning $11 a day to fuse steel into instruments of war. But Nelson saw more than just metal. He saw a system on the verge of breaking. Every day, he watched the same maddening ritual unfold. To install the thick wooden planking onto the steel decks of submarines and aircraft carriers, a team of men had to engage in a slow, primitive dance. Two men worked from above, drilling hundreds of holes through the dense wood and the deck plate below. Underneath, suspended on a precarious, greasy jungle of scaffolding, another one or two men had to wait. Their job was to painstakingly push a bolt up through each hole, secure it with a washer and a nut, and then tighten it, while the men above held the bolt head in place with a wrench. It was a process that made Nelson's blood boil. It was slow, requiring 5 to 7 full days to complete a single submarine deck. It was wasteful, demanding a small army of men and a mountain of complex scaffolding that had to be built and then torn down for each new section. And it was dangerous. A dropped wrench, a slippery bolt, a moment of lost balance, any of these could spell disaster in the cramped, poorly lit confines of a ship's hull. To Ted Nelson, a man who understood the elegant logic of molten steel, this wasn't just inefficient. It was an insult to common sense. It was, in a word, madness. He'd often mutter to his colleagues, a grin set to his jaw. There has to be a better way. This is a disgrace to the trade. But for the system, for the entire United States Navy, this was simply how things were done. This madness was happening against a backdrop of global fire. By the spring of 1941, the world was holding its breath. Nazi Germany had conquered France and was hammering Great Britain with its relentless blitz. The Japanese Empire was expanding its dominion across the Pacific with chilling speed. America, while officially neutral, was positioning itself as the arsenal of democracy, a manufacturing titan that would supply the Allies with the tools to fight back. President Franklin D. Roosevelt had called for unprecedented production numbers, demanding thousands of ships and planes. The shipyards, like Mare Island, were the front lines of this new industrial war. Speed was everything. Every ship launched ahead of schedule was another fortress on the sea, another lifeline to a world besieged. Yet, here, in the very heart of that arsenal, the gears were grinding. The mighty American war machine, capable of producing the world's most advanced engines and weaponry, was being slowed to a crawl by a construction method that hadn't fundamentally changed since the 19th century. The leadership of the Navy, the brilliant minds at the Bureau of Ships, had seemingly overlooked this glaring bottleneck. They were focused on grand strategies, on the caliber of naval guns and the thickness of armor plate, while the very foundation their ships were built upon was being laid with agonizing slowness. Every bolt, painstakingly tightened, was a tick of the clock, a moment lost in a race America could not afford to lose. The nation was preparing for a 20th century war using 19th century methods, and the disconnect was a chasm wide enough to swallow victory itself. Ted Nelson saw this chasm more clearly than anyone. He wasn't just a welder. He was a problem solver at his core. He saw the world in terms of forces, stresses, and bonds, and he saw a fundamental flaw in the bond being created between wood and steel. Why fight gravity? Why work from two sides of a steel plate when you could work from one? The question obsessed him. It followed him home from the shipyard, haunted his thoughts at the dinner table, and fueled his sketches on scrap paper late into the night. He envisioned a process that was clean, fast, and elegant. A process that could be executed by one man from one side in less than a second. This wasn't just a daydream to escape the daily grind. It was the spark of an idea so radical it bordered on heresy. It would mean throwing out the rule book, challenging the established procedures, and telling a chain of command stretching all the way to Washington, D.C., that their way was the wrong way. It was an idea that could revolutionize shipbuilding and give America the edge it so desperately needed. But it was also an idea that would put a simple $11 a day welder on a collision course with the most powerful and bureaucratic military organization on Earth. How could the entire might of the U.S. Navy, with its legions of engineers and strategists, be so blind to a problem that was staring them in the face? How could they be held captive by a process so fundamentally flawed? For Ted Nelson, these questions were no longer rhetorical. The answer was simply unacceptable. And deep in the furnace of his frustration, a brilliant, audacious idea was being forged, an idea that could save his country millions of hours of labor or completely destroy his own career in the process. He was about to declare war, not on a foreign enemy, but on the very system he worked for. Ted Nelson's solution wasn't born from complex schematics or advanced physics. It was born from the pure, simple logic of a master craftsman. He imagined a tool that would make the cumbersome, multi-man process of bolting obsolete. In his mind, he saw a handheld gun. This gun wouldn't fire a bullet. It would fire a single, perfectly placed metal stud onto a steel deck in the blink of an eye. The principle was a form of arc welding, a concept he knew like the back of his own hand. An electrical current would create. "Here's what we'll do," Morrison said, gathering Nelson's drawings into a neat pile. "You a superheated arc between the tip of the stud and the steel plate, melting both surfaces for a split second. The gun's mechanism would then plunge the stud into that molten puddle, creating a flawless, permanent bond. One man, one tool, one trigger pull. Click. Done." The true stroke of genius, however, wasn't just the gun itself. It was write up a formal proposal. "I will endorse it and forward it through the proper channels to the Bureau of Ships in Washington," a small, unassuming ceramic ring that Nelson called a ferrule. This little piece of clay was the secret ingredient. When placed, they have a technical review board that assesses all new engineering suggestions. For a fleeting moment, Nelson felt a spark of hope. Perhaps at the base of the stud, the ferrule would act as a tiny, temporary dam. It would contain the molten. The engineers in Washington would see the genius that his bosses could not. Then Morrison delivered the coup de grace. Now metal, shield the weld from contaminants in the air, and shape the cooling steel into a perfect, uniform collar. You should be aware, the Bureau is quite backlogged. The standard review process for a proposal of this nature, was a miniature, disposable crucible that guaranteed a flawless weld every single time, without fail. It was an elegant, it typically takes somewhere between 18 and 24 months. 18 to 24 months. The words echoed laughably, simple solution to a problem that had plagued shipbuilders for decades. The night he perfected the design in his head, in Nelson's head, louder than any hammer blow. In a world teetering on the brink of war, scribbling it onto a napkin on his kitchen table, he knew he held something revolutionary. He had replaced a team where every single day mattered. The system designed to make the Navy stronger was telling him to wait 2 years. It was of 4 men, a mountain of scaffolding, and a week of labor with a single spark that lasted less than a second. Armed in a timeline, it was a tombstone for his idea. It was a polite, bureaucratic no. He, with his meticulously drawn sketches and a confidence born of absolute certainty, Nelson approached his immediate superior. A young, by the book, understood instantly that his proposal would be filed away in a cabinet, buried under a mountain of paperwork, and forgotten. The officer named Lieutenant Morrison. Morrison was a product of the Naval Academy, a man who believed in structure, protocol, and the chain system wasn't designed to solve problems quickly. It was designed to protect itself from risk and innovation was the ultimate of command. He listened, with a detached sort of patience, as Nelson passionately laid out his idea, his calloused hands gesturing risk. He was being told to go back to his welding torch, to accept the madness, and to let the flow, to explain the flow of electricity and the function of the ceramic ferrule. Chief Engineer Hartwell, a man with decades experts, handled the thinking. Nelson walked away from that meeting, a changed man. The frustration that had simmered for months had of experience and a deep-seated skepticism for ideas that didn't originate from his own department was also called in to now hardened into cold, unshakable resolve. He had played by the rules, and the rules had failed him. He had listened. Nelson finished his presentation, his eyes shining with the conviction of a true believer. He looked at the two men, expecting to see a flicker of excitement, of understanding. Instead, he was met with a wall of polite indifference. Hartwell was offered a gift to his country, and his country, in the form of its rigid bureaucracy, had effectively thrown it in the first to speak, a slight patronizing smile on his face. "That's a clever thought, Nelson. Vary the trash." He stood at a fork in the road. One path was easy. Go back to work, collect his paycheck. Inventive for a welder. But what you're describing is a metallurgical and engineering challenge of a high order, and swallow his pride. He could watch the slow, wasteful dance of the bolting crews and know that he had tried his best. The other path was terrifying. It meant walking away from a steady job in the middle of the Great Depression. It were that simple. Our own engineers would have designed it years ago. He spoke as if Nelson were a child presenting. It meant betting his family's security on his own conviction. It meant becoming the very thing the system despised, an outsider. A drawing of a rocket ship made of cardboard. The implication was clear. You are a welder. We are engineers. Stay. The system had told him no. It had told him to wait in line while the world burned. But history, it in your lane. Lieutenant Morrison was more diplomatic, but his message was the same. "We appreciate your initiative, Nelson," he said, his tone flat and formal. "However, the United States Navy has established procedures for everything we do. These turned out, had a very different plan." The day after receiving the Navy's bureaucratic death sentence for his idea, Ted Nelson did the unthinkable. He walked into Lieutenant Morrison's office, placed his welder's helmet on the desk, and quietly resigned. For a working man in 1941, with the long shadow of the Great Depression still chilling the nation's economy, a steady government paycheck of $11 a day was a fortress of security. It meant food on the table, a roof over your head, and a small measure of certainty in an uncertain world. To voluntarily walk away from that was not just foolish. To many, it was an act of pure madness. Morrison was stunned, attempting to talk him out of it, framing it as a rash decision he would surely regret. But Nelson's resolve was forged in a fire hotter than any welding arc. He had a choice. He could serve the system, or he could serve the solution. He could not do both. He walked out of the gates of the Mare Island Naval Shipyard for the last time, not with a sense of failure, but with the terrifying, liberating clarity of a man who had just set fire to his own boat. There was no going back. That evening, he had to face a conversation far more daunting than any meeting with a naval officer. He had to explain his decision to his wife, Emma. Emma Nelson was not a woman given to flights of fancy. She was the anchor of their family, a practical woman who understood the brutal arithmetic of their household budget. When Ted told her he had quit his job to pursue an invention the Navy had already rejected, the color drained from her face. This is where the story often glosses over the true cost of innovation. It isn't just about sketches and prototypes. It's about the kitchen table conversations filled with fear and doubt. Emma stood in their modest living room, her hands twisting a dish towel. "Ted, they told you no," she said, her voice a mixture of love and desperation. "That job is all we have. The boys. How will we feed them? You're betting everything we've saved, our entire future, on a thing they don't even want. What if you're wrong?" It was a legitimate, terrifying question. Nelson didn't have a guaranteed answer. He had no purchase orders, no investors, no business plan. All he had was the unwavering belief that he was right. He took her hands and looked her in the eyes. "Emma," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I know how this looks. It's the biggest gamble of our lives. But I also know I'm right. And if I'm right, this thing won't just feed our family. It will help protect families all across this country. I have to try. I can't live with myself if I don't." The Nelson family garage, a simple wooden structure smelling of sawdust and oil, became the new front line. Ted cashed in their meager life savings and took out a loan, scraping together just enough capital to turn his drawings into steel. This was the birth of the Nelson Specialty Welding Equipment Corporation, a grand name for a one-man operation in a California garage. This space became a sanctuary of American ingenuity, a testament to the idea that a revolution doesn't need a boardroom. It just needs a workbench and a man who refuses to quit. Night after night, fueled by coffee and conviction, he tinkered. He machined parts, wound electrical coils, and experimented with different ceramic mixtures for his crucial ferrules. The garage was filled with the hum of his lathe and the sharp, electric scent of ozone from test welds on scrap metal. There were failures, prototypes that shorted out, welds that were brittle, moments of profound doubt when Emma's worried face would flash in his mind. In these moments, the weight of his gamble must have felt immense. He wasn't just an inventor in a vacuum. He was a husband and a father who had put his family's security on the line. He had stepped off a cliff, trusting he could build a plane on the way down. The pressure was enormous, but his belief was greater. He knew the principles were sound. He knew the physics worked. It was just a matter of perfecting the instrument. Then, one late night in July of 1941, it happened. He clamped a fresh piece of deck plate to his workbench, fitted a stud and a new ceramic ferrule into the nose of his latest prototype, a hefty, rugged-looking tool he had built with his own hands, and pressed it firmly against the steel. He took a deep breath, flipped down his welding mask, and pulled the trigger. There was a brilliant contained flash of white-hot light, a miniature sun born and extinguished in an instant, and a sharp thump. He lifted the gun. The stud was perfectly upright, fused to the plate. He picked up a hammer and gave the ceramic ferrule a sharp rap. It shattered away, as designed, revealing a clean, flawless, textbook-perfect weld. He grabbed a heavy wrench and tried to break it off. The stud wouldn't budge. He put all his weight into it, the steel plate groaning in protest. But the weld held firm, stronger than the metal around it. It was the eureka moment, the culmination of months of obsession, of defying his bosses, of gambling his family's future. His theory was no longer a theory. It was a fact, proven in solid steel on his workbench. He had done it. He had built a tool that could change the face of the war that he felt was inevitably coming. He had a working, perfected prototype of his stud welding gun. He possessed a solution so powerful it could accelerate the production of the entire U.S. Navy. But as he stood there, in the quiet solitude of his garage, a new and daunting reality set in. He had the perfect solution, but he no longer had a customer. The Navy had already shown him the door. To the rest of the world, he wasn't a visionary inventor. He was just another unemployed welder, tinkering in his garage with a strange-looking gun that nobody had asked for. He had built the perfect weapon. But as the summer of 1941 wore on, he had no war to fight. That is, until one quiet, peaceful Sunday morning in December that would change the world forever. On the morning of the 7th of December 1941, the world that had rejected Ted Nelson ceased to exist. As the sun rose over the Pacific, a wave of Japanese bombers and torpedo planes screamed out of the sky above Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. In less than 2 hours, the brutal, stunning blow shattered the morning calm, crippled the heart of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, and took the lives of over 2,400 Americans. The attack was more than a military strike. It was a psychological earthquake. A nation's confidence was rocked. Its sense of security was vaporized. and its long-held illusion of isolation was incinerated in the oily black smoke billowing from the sinking battleships. The next day, President Franklin D. Roosevelt stood before Congress and declared it a date which will live in infamy. America was at war. The sleeping giant, poked and prodded for years, was now fully, violently awake and filled with a terrible resolve. The debate was over. The time for caution was past. Survival was now the only objective. Overnight, the arsenal of democracy was no longer a supportive slogan. It became a desperate, all-consuming national mandate. Every factory, every shipyard, every man and woman capable of work was now a soldier on the home front of a global war. Back at the Mare Island Naval Shipyard, the shockwave of Pearl Harbor hit with the force of a physical impact. The once urgent production quotas suddenly seemed hopelessly inadequate. The pressure that had been mounting on men like Lieutenant Morrison and Chief Engineer Hartwell exploded, becoming an unbearable, round-the-clock crisis. Telegrams flew in from a panicked Washington, D.C., demanding the impossible: more ships, faster repairs, and a production timeline that defied the known laws of manufacturing. The 8 to 4-month review process for new ideas, the very process that had dismissed Ted Nelson, now seemed like a laughable, criminal relic from another, more naive century. Time was no longer measured in months or weeks, but in the hours it took for another island to fall, another convoy to be sunk. Suddenly, the slow, primitive dance of the bolting crews was no longer a mere inefficiency. It was a critical, bleeding wound in America's industrial capacity. Every one of the 5 to 7 days it took to bolt down a submarine deck was now a week that a U.S. submarine wasn't in the Pacific, hunting the very enemy fleet that had struck them. Every delayed aircraft carrier was another month that American pilots lacked a floating fortress from which to launch their counterattack. The 50 million man-hours that Nelson's rejected invention was poised to save were no longer just a startling statistic. They were a strategic asset America was squandering, a ghost fleet of ships that could have been, should have been, turning the tide of the war. Morrison and Hartwell were now trapped in a nightmare of their own making. They were good, loyal men, but they were men of the book, and the book was failing them. They pushed their crews harder, authorized massive overtime, and did everything within the established rules to increase output. But it was like trying to fill a bathtub with a thimble while the house was burning down. The bottleneck wasn't the workers' effort. It was the process itself, the very process they had defended with such bureaucratic certainty. In the frantic, sleep-deprived chaos of those first weeks of the war, they must have felt the immense weight of their short-sightedness. Somewhere, in the back of their frantic minds, there might have been a faint, nagging memory of a stubborn welder, his wild-eyed proposal, and their own polite, dismissive refusal. The rules of the game had been completely rewritten by the fires of war. The old systems, the established channels, the risk-averse committees, they were all luxuries of a bygone era of peace. The rigid wall of no that had stopped Ted Nelson had been demolished by enemy bombs. What the nation needed now was not another study or a lengthy approval process. It needed shortcuts. It needed pragmatic, real-world solutions. It needed men who knew how to get things done, regardless of what the rulebook said. The doors that had been slammed shut in Ted Nelson's face had not just been unlocked. They had been blown clean off their hinges by the blast wave of history. America didn't need a new committee or a fresh regulation. America needed a miracle. And that miracle, forged in a garage from defiance and steel, was sitting silently in California, waiting for a phone call. The phone call, when it finally came, wasn't a triumphant summons from the Bureau of Ships in Washington. There was no formal apology, no admission of short-sightedness from the top brass. The revolution began much more quietly, with a desperate plea from a single, overwhelmed shipyard. The Kaiser Shipyard in Richmond, California, was one of the epicenters of America's frantic wartime shipbuilding effort. Tasked by the industrialist Henry J. Kaiser with building hundreds of Liberty ships, the humble cargo vessels that would become the lifeline to Europe. The yard was under immense pressure to work faster than ever thought possible, and like Mare Island, they were being bled dry by the archaic process of bolting down wooden decks. Word of a mad welder from Mare Island, who had quit his job to build some kind of magical welding gun, had traveled along the waterfront grapevine. It was a rumor, a piece of shipyard lore, but in the crucible of war, desperation makes believers out of skeptics. A harried shipyard manager, a man likely at his wit's end, made a call. It probably wasn't a formal purchase order, but a challenge. "Nelson, I hear you've got a crazy idea." "Well, we're crazy enough to try anything right now. Get your gun down here. Show us what it can do." For Ted Nelson, this was the moment. The gamble he had placed in his garage was about to face its first real-world test. He arrived at the bustling, chaotic shipyard with his heavy, handmade prototype. A crowd of cynical, sweat-soaked shipbuilders gathered around, their faces etched with doubt. They had seen countless gadgets and miracle tools fail before. Nelson, calm and focused, simply asked for a power source and a piece of steel deck. He demonstrated the process once. Place the gun, pull the trigger. Thump. A perfect stud, permanently welded in less than a second. He invited one of the shipbuilders to try. The man, accustomed to the brute force of wrenches and hammers, handled the gun awkwardly at first, then pulled the trigger. Thump. Another perfect weld. A murmur went through the crowd. This wasn't some flimsy gadget. This was different. The real proof came when they put the gun to work on an actual Liberty ship deck. A task that would have taken a four-man crew, the better part of a day, was completed by two men in under an hour. The results were not just impressive, they were revolutionary. It was a quantum leap in efficiency. The managers at the Kaiser Yard didn't need a committee or a 24-month study to understand what they were seeing. They saw ships being built faster. They saw man-hours being saved. They immediately ordered every stud gun Nelson could possibly make. The trickle of interest had become a flood. The Nelson Specialty Welding Equipment Corporation had just landed the most important customer in the world, the American war effort. But the impact of Nelson's invention went far beyond mere speed. It triggered a profound social transformation right on the factory floor. As millions of men went off to fight overseas, millions of women stepped up to take their places in the shipyards and factories. These Rosie the Riveters, or, in this case, Wendy the Welders, became the backbone of the home front. However, traditional welding was a difficult, physically demanding skill that required extensive training. Nelson's gun changed that equation completely. It was so simple, so foolproof, that a novice could be trained to use it effectively in a matter of hours. It was an equalizer. It democratized the skill of welding, empowering this new, diverse workforce to contribute at a master craftsman's level almost immediately. Imagine a young woman in 1942, perhaps a former schoolteacher or a homemaker, stepping into the deafening, intimidating world of a shipyard for the first time. She would have been handed a tool that didn't rely on brute strength, but on a simple, elegant process. With Nelson's gun in her hands, she could perform a critical, structural task with the same speed and perfection as a man who had been welding for 20 years. This wasn't just about building ships, it was about building a new American workforce. The invention's genius wasn't just that it was fast, but that it was accessible. It allowed the arsenal of democracy to tap into the full potential of its citizenry, unleashing a wave of productivity that stunned the Axis powers. The gun didn't just fuse steel, it fused a nation's workforce together in a common, urgent cause. The news of this miraculous tool spread like wildfire through the defense industry. Orders began pouring in, not just from Kaiser, but from shipyards all across the country. Nelson's garage-based operation exploded overnight. He had to hire staff, lease a larger manufacturing space, and ramp up production to a 24/7 schedule just to keep up with the insatiable demand. The same naval officers and engineers who had once politely dismissed him were now on the phone, not with suggestions, but with urgent, multi-million-dollar purchase orders. Lieutenant Morrison and Chief Engineer Hartwell, back at Mare Island, now had to process requisitions for the very device they had told Nelson was an unconventional fantasy. The irony must have been staggering. The welder they had patronized had become one of the most critical suppliers for the United States Navy. The system had told him no, but the unstoppable logic of results, powered by the urgency of war, was now screaming a definitive yes. By 1943, the Nelson Specialty Welding Equipment Corporation was no longer a one-man shop in a garage. It was a roaring engine of the American war machine, a critical hub in the vast network of industrial power that was slowly, inexorably turning the tide of the war. Ted Nelson was no longer an unemployed welder with a crazy idea. He was a respected industrialist, a problem solver whose invention was being used in every major shipyard from the coast of California to the shores of Maine. He had achieved a level of success that must have seemed like a distant dream during those desperate nights of tinkering. He had wealth, he had a thriving business, and he had the deep satisfaction of knowing his work was making a tangible difference every single day. But one thing was still missing. There had never been an official acknowledgement from the very institution that had so thoroughly and dismissively rejected him. That changed on a crisp autumn day. A polished black car, the kind reserved for high-ranking officials, pulled up to Nelson's bustling factory. Out stepped a man in a pristine, starched white officer's uniform, his shoulders adorned with the rank of a Navy captain. His name was Captain Harrison, and he had been sent from the Bureau of Ships in Washington, D.C. This was not an inspection or a routine supplier visit. An institution built on centuries of tradition, iron, and authority is not accustomed to admitting it was wrong. This visit was something else entirely. It was a pilgrimage. It was an act of surrender by the very bureaucracy that had once declared Nelson's idea unworthy of even a timely review. Captain Harrison was led through the noisy factory floor, past the rows of men and women efficiently assembling the very guns that were revolutionizing their industry. He found Ted Nelson not in a plush corner office, but on the factory floor, his sleeves rolled up, discussing a design tweak with one of his machinists. Nelson was still, at his core, a hands-on craftsman. The two men stood there for a moment, a perfect tableau of the story's central conflict. A welder in practical, oil-stained work clothes, and a captain in a dress uniform representing the two worlds that had once been at odds. Nelson, ever the pragmatist, likely expected a discussion about a new contract or a production quota. He was not expecting what came next. In the relative quiet of Nelson's small office, surrounded by blueprints and schematics, Captain Harrison did not waste time with pleasantries. He was a man on a mission, and that mission was to correct a profound institutional error. "Mr. Nelson," he began, his voice formal but sincere, "I've been sent here today on behalf of the United States Navy. We've been analyzing the production data from the shipyards, all of them. We've been looking at the construction timelines for everything from submarines to aircraft carriers. And in all of our calculations, one variable has appeared that has fundamentally changed the equation. Your stud welding gun." He paused, letting the weight of his words fill the small room. Nelson simply waited, his expression unreadable. "Your invention," the captain continued, "has dramatically increased the speed and efficiency of American shipbuilding at the most critical moment in our nation's history. And we, the Navy, have a duty to acknowledge that. We also have a duty to acknowledge how we initially handled your proposal." He looked Nelson directly in the eye. "On behalf of the United States Navy, and with the full authority of the Bureau of Ships, I am here to say that we made a mistake, a significant one. Your idea should have been recognized and embraced from the very beginning. The delay was our failure, not yours." This was it. The moment of complete and total vindication. It wasn't just an order for more equipment. It was a direct apology from the heart of the system that had wronged him. For a lesser man, it might have been a moment for gloating, for an "I told you so." But for Nelson, it was likely a quiet, deeply satisfying affirmation of a simple truth he had known all along. He had seen a problem and offered a solution. Now, the world had finally caught up. But Captain Harrison was not finished. Acknowledging our error is one thing, he said, opening a briefcase. Quantifying the impact of your contribution is another. He pulled out a thick report. Our top analysts have spent months calculating the net savings in labor from the adoption of your technology across the entire war effort. They've accounted for every class of ship, every shipyard, every application. The final number they arrived at is staggering. He looked up from the page. Mr. Nelson, by the end of this war, it is estimated that your invention will have saved the United States Navy more than 50 million man-hours of labor. 50 million hours. The number itself is so vast, it's almost meaningless. It's an astronomical figure that the human mind struggles to grasp. So, let's put that into perspective. 50 million hours is the equivalent of more than 19,000 people working full-time, 40 hours a week, for an entire year. It's the equivalent of one person working around the clock since the Stone Age. It was a gift of time, a colossal infusion of efficiency injected directly into the veins of the war effort. It wasn't just about saving money on labor. It was about what that time could now be used for. It was 50 million hours that could be redirected to building more tanks, more planes, and more of the crucial tools of war. Those 50 million hours were a strategic weapon. They translated directly into hundreds of additional ships being launched months ahead of the old schedules. They were destroyers in the Atlantic, protecting convoys from U-boats. They were aircraft carriers in the Pacific, providing the floating airfields needed to push back the Japanese Empire island by island. They were submarines, the silent hunters, prowling the shipping lanes and crippling the enemy's supply lines. Every hour saved was a life potentially saved. It was a pilot who had a carrier to land on, a soldier who got the supplies he needed, a battle that was won because the fleet arrived on time. In the brutal calculus of war, Ted Nelson's gun hadn't just saved time, it had saved lives. Captain Harrison presented Nelson with the Navy's highest civilian honor, the E for Excellence Award, a formal recognition of his monumental contribution. The welder, who had once been dismissed as an eccentric, was now officially celebrated as a national hero of industry. He had won. He had faced down the wall of no, gambled everything on his own conviction, and had been proven right on a scale he could never have imagined. The war would still rage on for another 2 years. But for Ted Nelson, his personal battle was over. He had received his unlikely apology, but the story of his invention, the revolution he had started in his garage, was far from over. The war would eventually end, but the impact of his idea was just beginning to reshape the modern world. In 1945, the guns of the Second World War fell silent. The great fleets returned to harbor, and the colossal engine of the American war machine began to power down. For many wartime industries, peace brought an uncertain future. Factories that had churned out tanks and bombers 24/7 suddenly went quiet, their purpose fulfilled. One might have assumed that the Nelson stud welding gun, a tool forged in the crucible of military necessity, would meet a similar fate. Its war was won, its job was done. But the true genius of Ted Nelson's invention was not that it was a weapon of war, but that it was a fundamental solution to a universal problem: how to attach things to steel, quickly and efficiently, from one side. The war was simply the catalyst that proved its undeniable value to the world. As America pivoted from fighting a war to building a new era of prosperity, the demand for Nelson's technology didn't just continue, it exploded. The same gun that had secured the wooden decks of aircraft carriers was now being used to build the steel skeletons of a new America. The post-war construction boom was on, and Nelson's stud welding was at the very heart of it. Architects and engineers, seeking to build higher, faster, and more economically, saw the gun for what it was: a revolutionary tool. It was used to anchor the metal decking that held the concrete floors of skyscrapers, to attach curtain walls and facades to buildings, and to secure the rebar in sprawling new bridges that would soon connect the nation in the great interstate highway system. Every time you see footage of a steelworker walking a high beam on a skyscraper in the 1,950 seconds, you are looking at a world that Ted Nelson helped build. The applications seemed endless. The automotive industry in Detroit adopted the technology to weld fasteners to car frames, simplifying assembly lines and making vehicles stronger and safer. In manufacturing, it was used to attach everything from handles to machinery to insulation in furnaces. The simple, elegant process, born in a garage, was now a foundational component of modern industrial life. The name Ted Nelson may not have been known to the average person, but his legacy was all around them. In the buildings they worked in, the cars they drove, and the bridges they crossed. He had taken a process that was once a bottleneck and transformed it into a cornerstone of progress. And what of the Mare Island Naval Shipyard? The place where it all began, the institution that represented the old way of thinking, the bureaucratic inertia that had so confidently told Nelson, no. For decades after the war, it continued to serve the Navy, a powerful symbol of American military might. But the world was changing. By the end of the Cold War, the perceived need for such a massive naval infrastructure began to wane. In 1996, after more than 140 years of service, the Mare Island Naval Shipyard was officially decommissioned. The very gates that Ted Nelson had walked out of in defiance were closed for the final time. Today, it stands as a historical landmark, a quiet ghost of its former glory, its silent workshops, a museum to a bygone era. Herein lies the ultimate, poetic irony of this entire story. The system, the institution, the seemingly permanent fixture of authority that had deemed Nelson's idea unworthy, eventually faded into history. It became a relic, but the idea, the simple, powerful idea born in the mind of a single, determined welder, that idea thrived. Nelson Stud Welding, the company that began with a handful of cash and a family's future on the line, grew into a global powerhouse. Today, it is still a world leader in fastener technology, its products used in countless applications across the globe. The institution died, but the innovation proved to be immortal. Ted Nelson's true legacy, then, is not measured in the number of guns he sold or the millions of dollars his company made. It is not even measured by that staggering figure of 50 million man-hours. His real legacy is a powerful, timeless lesson that resonates just as strongly today as it did in 1941. He proved that the most valuable insights often come not from the executive boardroom, but from the factory floor. He demonstrated that the person closest to the problem is often the person closest to the solution. His story is a testament to the fact that one individual's common sense, backed by unwavering courage, can be more powerful than the entrenched procedures of the largest organizations on Earth. He didn't just invent a new tool, he validated a core principle of the American spirit, that innovation comes from the individual, that progress is driven by those who refuse to accept that's just the way things are done, and that sometimes the most patriotic act a person can commit is to defy the very system they are trying to serve. He reminds us that the experts don't always have the answers, and that a good idea doesn't need a pedigree or a fancy degree to be valid. All it needs is a champion willing to bet on it. Ted Nelson saw a problem, he knew the solution, and he refused to be silenced by the chorus of no. His story is now a part of history, but the question it poses is aimed squarely at our present. It challenges every one of us, in our own lives, our own jobs, and our own industries, to look at the inefficiencies we accept as normal, and to ask the same simple, powerful question he did. Isn't there a better way? The story of Ted Nelson isn't just a fascinating piece of World War II history. It's not just about a clever invention or a staggering number of hours saved. It's a blueprint. It's a living testament to a power that exists within each of us. The power to see what is and to imagine what could be. Every single day, in our own lives, we face our own versions of that slow, maddening process of bolting down the deck. We encounter systems, rules, and procedures that are inefficient, illogical, or just plain broken. It happens in our workplaces, in our communities, even in our own routines. And we are met with the same chorus of voices that Ted Nelson heard. That's just the way we've always done it. It's not your place to question the process. If it were a good idea, someone would have thought of it already. The experts have looked at this, and this is the best way. These are the walls of no that surround us. They are the modern-day equivalents of that 8 to 2 4-month review process, designed to protect the status quo and to gently, politely, encourage us to give up and get back in line. We are told to trust the system, to follow the rules, to wait for permission. Ted Nelson's legacy screams at us across the decades with a single, defiant message: don't. So, this is the question his story leaves us with. It's not a historical question, it's a personal one. When the experts tell you that your idea is unconventional, that you need to wait your turn, that you should leave the thinking to the people in charge, what will you do? When the system presents you with a choice between the easy path of compliance and the difficult, lonely road of conviction, which will you choose? They tell you that your idea needs 18 to 24 months for approval. The real question is, where is your garage? They tell you that you don't have the right degree, the right title, or the right credentials to solve the problem. The real question is, what can your hands build? They tell you the risk is too great, that you're gambling with your security. Ted Nelson's story asks us all to consider that sometimes the greatest risk is inaction. The most dangerous gamble is to silently accept a broken system when you know, in your gut, that there is a better way. The world is filled with problems, waiting for their Ted Nelson. It's the teacher who sees a better way to inspire a student, the programmer who knows there's a more elegant line of code, the small business owner who finds a clever solution to a customer's frustration, the parent who challenges a school policy that isn't serving the children. These moments of insight don't happen in committees. They happen in the minds of individuals who are close enough to the work to see the flaws and brave enough to imagine a solution. This is why we want to hear from you. The history books are filled with famous generals and presidents, but the real story of how the world moves forward is written in the garages, the workshops, and the late-night kitchen tables of people like Ted Nelson. It's written by people who refuse to take no for an answer. So, tell us in the comments below, have you ever had a Ted Nelson moment? A time when you saw a broken process and knew you had a better way? Did you challenge it? What happened? Share your story, because your experience might just be the spark of courage that someone else needs to see. The story of the welder, whose rejected gun saved 50 million man-hours and helped win a war, is more than just a story. It's a challenge. It's a reminder that the most powerful engine of change isn't a government or a corporation. It's a single, determined person who is willing to stand up and say, "This is madness, and I will be the one to fix it." Don't wait for permission. Don't wait for the experts. Find your garage. Solve the problem. History is waiting for the next Ted Nelson. Will it be you?